We'll manage. Oh, damn it.
It was a mid-70s look at life after a virus wiped out most of the world's population, which was great news for agoraphobics, but bad news for travel agents organising group bookings to Marbella. Oh, and everyone else as well. A remounted series in 2008 also looked at life after a pandemic wiped out almost everyone. But if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Please don't let me be the only one.
Survivors.
This simple metal knife is the product of hundreds of people in dozens of different trades.
We've looked at the 1975 BBC series Survivors before, along with some other post-apocalyptic BBC shows. But today we're taking the bones of that original review, updating it, and taking a more detailed look at the 1975 to 77 series and the 2008 remake of Survivors.
Oh, please, God. Don't let me be the only one.
If we are being pedantic, the 2008 series is not a remake, but an adaptation of Terry Nation's novelisation, which was published after he'd left the original series. Glad we cleared that up.
So we don't know what's going to happen. Rats, dogs, blight. So we must plan, but we must keep it flexible.
Survivors uses a science fiction what-if premise to extrapolate how a group of survivors might deal with making it through a deadly pandemic. But after episode 1, it's strictly a drama about a group of characters and how they make it through a world where a large part of the population has died. So, if you hate having to make awkward small talk with that overly chatty lady manning the checkout at the supermarket, you're in luck. However, if you're that friendly staff member who looks at the world with a song in their heart and has a smile for every customer and a little bit of chit-chat to pass the time of day, then you may be up shit creek.
Well, that's that then.
In this video, we do talk about series and seasons, as in years of the show being made, and we do use them interchangeably, just because we know how much it annoys some people.
Just to spite me.
In both versions of the series, a virus wipes out over 95% of the world's population, including, ironically enough, conspiracy theorists who had wrongly assumed that them being in the know somehow provided them with some sort of biological shield.
It's not very right in the head, but he might get over it.
Post-apocalyptic settings have been popular in movies for decades, but old-school TV had often shied away from trying to show too much of life after everything ends. Older series tended to be post-nuclear, like Buck Rogers or Logan's Run. Post-virus was handy since you could pretty much film that anywhere on a quiet Sunday morning. Post-virus would morph into zombie apocalypse, which is like a normal apocalypse, but with a difficulty setting up to super extreme hard mode.
You said that the dormitories were full of corpses.
But let's travel back to the 1970s, when the BBC destroyed the world in 1975 on a weekly budget of £1.50, and that is including VAT. Clearly, £1.50 had a lot more spending power in the 1970s than it does now. I've heard from several reliable sources, well, Facebook, that you could buy a 5-bedroom house in central London in 1975 for £1.50, though the average wage was something like 9 pence a week. Of course, my source is some drunk guy in a pub talking to my uncle's best mate's neighbour's nephew's crystal healer.
And that one thing that we have in common, that we are survivors.
Survivors started with an idea from Welsh writer Terry Nation. In the 1960s, he'd been an unemployed comedy writer who took on some quick work, dashing out 7 episodes for a new kids' science fiction series that the BBC was knocking together. Except those dashed-out episodes introduced the Daleks, which sent both the series Doctor Who and Terry Nation's career into the stratosphere. By the early 70s, he was doing well and living in a big house in the country, and like many middle-class people who lived in big houses in the early 70s, he became enamoured with the likes of John Seymour's book, Self-Sufficiency. The self-sufficiency movement in the UK became a thing in certain circles that, could afford it, and it had a brief moment as a fashionably popular movement. Self-sufficiency is much like doomsday prepping, but with a posher accent and a degree.
It's just that I hadn't seen it that way, that's all.
As it was the 1970s, it was Terry Nation who had the idea, but it was really up to his wife Kate to do the actual self-sufficiency. Terry Nation would maintain that he'd had the idea about a post-apocalyptic series starting in the late 60s, a claim that would later end up being the subject of a court case with Avengers writer and producer Brian Clemens. The case would drag on for years, and Clemens would later drop the claim, but the pair's long-standing friendship did not survive.
The stench. It was like a brick wall, man, like a wall!
As Terry Nation would explain it, if the world ended tomorrow, he would be useless since he didn't even know how to make a candle.
Could you make that? Where does the raw material come from, do you know?
Look, I too do not know how to make 1 candle, nor can I mind the tin and learn blacksmithing enough to fashion 4 candles.
And a few candles.
Most people who had thoughts like this would just swear off gin before 10 a.m, but as a successful television writer, Terry Nation pitched an idea to BBC executives for a series about those who were left after the end of the world. And because his meeting started first thing after a liquid lunch at 3 p.m, they bought the show, before staggering to the bar in time for 5 o'clock drinkies.
Oops, pardon me.
Nation's original pitch was for a show called Beyond Omega. It didn't immediately catch on with the executives because, having been educated at either Oxford or Cambridge, they would often argue in regards to the correct pronunciation of Omega, or Omega, or Omega, without any of them bothering to ask somebody called Stavros.
Gosh, that sounds exciting.
After a few false starts, Survivors premiered on the BBC in 1975. The title sequence depicted a containment breach in a lab that led to a scientist infected by some virus, who then inadvertently spreads it throughout the world thanks to jet travel. Thanks a bunch, jets. At the time, it was seen as a cool and stylish way to set up the virus outbreak, but it's now fuel for folks who cannot tell the difference between fiction and reality. Thanks a bunch, fiction.
I know Queensberry rules for survival.
Terry Nation's work could veer between by-the-numbers action-adventure filled with repackaged cliches dashed out in a few days, and well-thought-out stories based on strong ideas. Survivors, thankfully, started out as the latter. Terry Nation also recognised that much of his previous work had poorly written roles for women, so Survivor's main character would be a woman.
It's too bloody late.
Episode 1 starts with 2 contrasting women as the focus, a barely getting by woman in her enormous house in the country, and a temp secretary sharing a flat in London. Abby Grant is a struggling housewife trying to make ends meet with her tiny country house with a second-hand tennis court and only 1 full-time housekeeper to assist her while her Jensen-driving husband works in London and her son is off at boarding school. They are so poor and close to becoming destitute that they can only afford 5 continental skiing holidays a year. Woof.
So he's a bit of a joker, is he?
Yes, it's the mid-1970s BBC, so their depiction of what they would call middle class is what would count in most people's books as pretty freaking well-to-do.
In those terms, I'm sure we'll be quite well-to-do.
In this world before the outbreak, Abby is about as useful as a social media influencer spruiking veterinary products for human consumption. But unlike an influencer dashing to the toilet every 5 minutes, Abby will find purpose in this post-apocalyptic world. Carolyn Seymour as Abby often has an aristocratic demeanour to begin with. She'll quickly become somebody thrust into a leadership position that she didn't want. The show starts off fairly routine. Well, as routine as you get when you have a housekeeper and a tennis court and a kid off at boarding school and 5 skiing holidays on your year planner. But as life goes on for Abby, each scene subtly increases the severity of the problem. First, there's a bad flu epidemic. Then there are disruptions to services such as trains, Tinder is offline, hospitals are at breaking point since people either have the virus or blue balls. Survivors was a serious show where everything was played straight down the line. There was no background music in an episode, which gave the proceedings an almost documentary-like feel in early episodes.
Everything's all gone to pot.
Meanwhile, Jenny is having problems with her roommate, who's bedridden and, more importantly, unable to pay her half of the rent. Her roommate's boyfriend won't help out with the rent since the roommate is scheduled to die in the next scene, but he paints a doom-laden picture.
In all the cases we have admitted, only 1 person has lived beyond the crisis point.
Abby feels a bit off, has a fever, and wakes up a few days later to find that her husband has died.
Oh, how awful.
And the people next door are dead.
Goodness, how awful.
And the people across the street are dead.
How awful.
And the people down the street are dead.
Oh, that's awful.
As are the local shopkeepers.
Gosh, that's awful.
And that really snooty lady down at the post office.
Good riddance to bad rubbish.
Abby, despite being a struggling middle-class housewife, is strong and independent, a born leader by virtue of, apparently, being middle class.
Oh, that's marvellous. I've been meaning to ask you about that.
While Jenny is more empathetic and feels the need to be around other people, she's more likely to follow, but despite being more overtly frightened, is resilient in her own way.
The town was awful, so we detoured and found a village and came in upwind.
Both women have the situation mansplained by various guys they encounter, but those freelance contract mansplainers are all dead by the end of the episode, so the series would have to introduce its own full-time in-house mansplainer in episode 2.
Otherwise, I shall just have to invent a pump.
Greg Preston is an engineer who's also that favourite character from the 70s, the sort of hero guy who keeps saying how he's just here for now, but he probably won't hang around.
Just drive round for a while, I suppose.
even though you know he will probably hang around.
Yeah, well, I'd like to ride around with you for a while, just so I can pick up a car.
We know this because he makes an effort to tell everybody he meets that he probably won't stick around, but he also doesn't really make all that much effort to leave.
Oh, hang around for a while, I suppose.
Once Greg's on the scene, he'll meet up with Abby and Jenny, and Greg will explain all the practical problems and possible solutions. Jenny will be the heart of the group and give us the sense of the ordinary person's reaction to the situation, and Abby is the one trusted with the most difficult decisions.
Can I hug you?
Greg and Jenny will become a couple fairly soon, and their relationship would endure mostly throughout the entire 3-season run of the show. Ian McCulloch had impressed the show's producer in an episode of the POW drama Colditz, while Lucy Fleming was the niece of Ian Fleming.
I'm sorry, it's just that I've seen you before.
Carolyn Seymour would later work extensively on American television.
I mean, how long before things start to get back to normal?
Normal? Never.
Survivor's first half-dozen episodes set the scene in the immediate aftermath of the epidemic that has killed almost everybody. At one point, it's estimated that after the plague, the British Isles had a population of around 10,000, where no two survivors knew each other before the plague, which will eventually be known as the Death. Some of these details will change over time, with some parts of the country having larger populations than originally thought, and some people who actually knew each other beforehand, all of which might give hope to these British survivors that one day they might once again fulfill their manifest destiny and have enough people to form an orderly queue. We'll see a few corpses in long shot, but nothing too gruesome. There's not a single buzzing fly to be heard. There'll be a lot of talk about rotting corpses in the cities, but talk is cheap. And since it's the BBC in the 1970s, there's a lot of talking.
All those unburied dead, and God knows what sort of disease building up.
Abby sees the value in setting up a new community and plans for it, but she also cannot let go of the idea that her son, Peter, might still be alive. The trio explore their new worlds, keeping to rural backroads to keep away from disease and pestilence, but just as importantly, to keep the budget down. As a group, they'll come across other groups banding together, each with some philosophy that puts off Abby, Jenny and Greg before the inevitable happens and the group settle in one enormous house to set up a new community.
Oh, what a dump.
No. Could be worse.
Over the course of the first year, other people will join their band. Arthur, Charmian, Vic, Emma, Barney, Wendy, and the dazzlingly unreliable Tom Price. While Greg and Jenny will more or less adopt orphans John and Lizzie.
I'll bet we'll never see another orange again as long as we live.
There are people who pine for the good old days from before the plague, and one or two people who embrace the opportunity to make a new world.
I tried to make 4 women conceive.
The one common frame of reference for new characters is for them to talk about their experiences during the plague, watching loved ones die and how they got by in the aftermath. Closest anybody gets to delusions and conspiracy theories is when they think it'll all be over soon and things will be back to normal in just a few months.
The Yanks love something, don't worry.
Once the group settled into a deserted country house, the show became less of an adventure and more of a soap opera, a feeling that is enhanced by a move for the series being recorded on outside broadcast video equipment, basically the same gear used for exteriors for soap operas and live sports. The cameras were a little smaller than the ones in the TV studio, but the accompanying gear such as tape machines and mixing equipment filled BBC scanner vans, which meant locations had to be somewhere within cabling distance of wherever the scanner and generators were parked. It was as close as you could get to popping all of Television Centre on the back of a flatbed truck and shipping it off into the country. It was still a multi-camera operation, often having a vision mixer live switching the feeds from 2 cameras as the scenes were recorded to 2-inch analog tape.
There's a kind of pattern emerging.
An episode made this way would differ from traditional BBC productions that were usually recorded in a studio. Each episode would allow for around a day and a half of rehearsal and then 4 or so days of recording. That made for a fast turnaround of episodes, which helped keep the show's production schedule on track.
Let's get it done.
The sorts of things we'd see in these episodes: a group of well-spoken thugs want to steal a fuel tanker from the group, or a trader's pregnant girlfriend seeks asylum in Abby's commune. But in the most talked about episode, Barney, with the mental age of a conspiracy theorist, is wrongly accused of murdering Wendy, and the group have to decide if he's guilty, and if so, what do they then do with him? And then, what do they do with the real killer? Apparently the answer was, don't renew the actors' contracts for a second series just yet.
We shouldn't decide what to do about it until we've reached a verdict.
Characters would come and go, or would be recast for various reasons, or killed off screen at the whims of the producer, or just never be spoken of again.
My dear girl, you tell them what the objective is and let them get on with it.
Producer Terence Dudley was somebody who had a knack for not getting along with the people who worked for him. Dudley had previously worked as a producer on the early 70s science fiction drama Doomwatch, where he did not see eye to eye with that show's creators, who promptly left.
I don't mind telling you, we could have a good fight. I'll be the first to admit that.
On Survivors, Dudley clashed with Carolyn Seymour, with Terry Nation, and with several of the writers on the show. Call it a clash of styles, a battle of egos, or people smoking pipes throwing typewriter ribbons at each other at 10 paces.
Are you being deliberately offensive, young man?
But Dudley as producer would win those battles and quickly manage to domesticate the apocalypse. Terry Nation would leave the show after the first season, as did the show's star Carolyn Seymour. Survivors had reasonable but not amazing viewing figures, but the show would eventually run for 3 years, which is a long time to watch characters making grand speeches about the nature of survival and humanity and methane production, which, after watching Survivors, I've learned is a load of old shit.
Waste of good pig dung, if you ask me.
The second year changed locations to a commune and became even more of a soap opera. With Abby Grant gone, the leadership void is filled by Charles Vaughan as a second mansplainer.
Well, with a bit of jiggery-pokery, we've managed to come up with a primitive but workable telephone system.
Legacy supporting characters are killed off, some off-screen in the first episode, and the rest during the course of the season. New characters were introduced, such as Charles's wife Pet, a former docker-turned-carpenter Jack, and Hubert, a shepherd with a sartorial style that could best be described as dung heap deconstruction.
You know how I feel about you.
Stick to your sheep.
Hubert, as a character, is comic relief, an agent of chaos, and the guy who can be relied upon to say the absolute worst thing in any situation, much like my Uncle Rodney, who of course is now serving a 10-year sentence for fraud after he admitted to trying to sell his own farts as nitrous oxide.
Got yourself into trouble, I hear.
Other people come and go. A group of youngsters join the commune, but there's a generation gap happening between Greg and Charles on the one hand, and the youngsters wanting to do youngstery things. Ruth is a doctor who insists that they need to look after their hygiene in order to look after their health.
You keep clean, we keep healthy. It's as simple as that.
And so the series will have two threads in the background where people will make trips to brine pits to collect salt for preserving food, and then there's the making of soap, as well as a running commentary on how gross making soap is.
It's worse than being downwind of Hubert.
Welshman Charles Vaughan was played by New Zealand actor Dennis Lill in a very, very fine wig.
It's not working, is it?
Where originally he'd just been a character seen in one episode in the first series. Now as the show's co-lead character, Charles is big on making speeches and will avail himself of any opportunity to persuade people to do things his way. At one point, he and Pet stay in a dangerous situation purely because Charles wants to participate in a hostile debate with the rival settlement's leaders.
Afraid your people might prefer my ideas.
3 episodes this season did revert to the traditional way of making television with a mix of filmed location work and interiors shot in the studio, but the bulk of the series was still made on location with the outside broadcast equipment. So, Survivors didn't just look like a soap opera, it was one where people actually sat around and talked about making soap. By now, Survivors were using even less and less of what was left over from civilization, so motor vehicles were rarely used and even ammunition for their shotguns was becoming scarce. Season 2 was often about staving off disease, the ins and outs of animal husbandry, and the mechanics of getting by, which of course meant the manufacture of soap. I myself am not a soap maker, but I am a soap user. But I used to share a damp basement flat with somebody who was a soap maker, but was not a soap user. Now, you might call this a new spin on The Odd Couple, but I've come to think of this period in my life as the long dank stank.
Oh, it doesn't smell like soap.
A 2-part story, Lights of London, had Ruth, Greg and Charles visit London, which was one of the very few times that the series would show us any of the cities or towns since the plague struck.
What are those fires?
They are started by spontaneous combustion.
Heaps of bodies.
The rest of the time they were back at Whitecross talking about how they made lanterns, or detailed Greg's attempts to make methane gas to power a tractor, or Hubert trying to get him some.
Those of us who've achieved a certain standard of hygiene are not going to put up with less.
Filming in an actual commune gave the series a texture as it examined actual attempts at survival and self-sufficiency, but with fewer of the major moral dilemmas that we would see in the first season. Disease was a big problem. Not so much the original plague, but things like typhoid and cholera, and similar diseases, which was a favourite way of writing out cast members. The show established a canon about the original plague, where some people would get the disease but recover and others were completely immune, but that both groups were also carriers who could kill off anybody they met who hadn't been exposed to death. This is what they would call the ultimate spoiler.
She attacked me. How?
She wiped a wet nappy across his face.
Most episodes had some character acting as an antagonist, such as Hubert stirring the pot when he didn't get his way.
Oh, shut up.
Or they were trying to deal with outbreaks of a disease. On occasion, actual villains would show up to sow disharmony, and yes, side characters would often just be there so someone was there to die. A lapsed priest is introduced in one episode where he renews his faith, and then he's killed off a few episodes later by some thugs. A farming expert isn't quite a villain, just really bad at dealing with people. And the youngsters in the commune aren't quite ready to become baby factories. Survivors often wrestle with the idea of repopulating the human race as an imperative, yet the young women, having finally gained some sort of independence in the years before their death, see off various attempts to regress their autonomy.
If we're going to have a baby farm here, the least you can do is let the women choose the fathers.
While life in front of the camera was fairly grim,
What alcohol?
life behind the scenes was also not particularly peachy. In fact, it wasn't even remotely nectarine. Apart from producer Terence Dudley's innate ability to drive off collaborators, there were also ongoing issues with the series' stars.
Charles, we get on well enough, but you know as well as I do, there just isn't room for the two of us here.
Actors Dennis Lill and Ian McCulloch apparently did not get on. The clash of egos between the characters of Charles and Greg was occasionally apparent on screen, when the pair would occasionally slightly disagree with each other on an issue. But behind the scenes, the two top dogs were also rather competitive, to the point where there was talk of one actor counting their lines and comparing them to their co-stars. In the final episode of the second series, a hot air balloon with a Norwegian surveyor crashes near the White Cross community, which kicks off a renewed sense of purpose, with Charles and Greg putting aside self-sufficiency in favour of organising various specialised settlements into trading with each other. As it turns out, while their settlement was trying to organise defensive alliances with neighbours and raise animals and make soap, other settlements had specialties. Greg and the Norwegian's daughter Agnes head off in the balloon to try and re-establish trade links between the various English settlements and Norway.
I wonder who'll be Prime Minister, Greg or Charlie?
That's anyone's guess.
Ian McCulloch in effect left the series at the end of season 2, though he would return to appear in just 2 episodes of the 3rd season, both of which he wrote, where coincidentally enough, Charles does not appear in any major role. The commune used as the location for the 2nd series had broken up, but the show's 3rd and ultimately final series would return to a show where the characters roamed the countryside, with only occasional scenes set at home base. Greg has been out and about mapping the various settlements, while Jenny and Charles will ostensibly be on a quest to catch up with him, despite real-world issues between the stars making sure that that would never happen. Agnes would be the only character who would appear in both stories with Greg, and episodes featuring Charles, Jenny and Hubert. Jenny would get close to catching up with Greg, but would miss him by a few days. Now you can just tell that this was made in a time before the invention of a fridge whiteboard. However, Charles and his group have set up a working telephone system with daily scheduled calls, yet for behind-the-scenes reasons, Greg doesn't ever think to pick up the phone.
We'll end, not with a bang, but with a whimper.
In this 3rd series, the main group encounters various settlements who might be interested in some sort of federation, working together, all while Charles, Jenny and Hubert collect specialists as they travel through the north of England, where their eventual goal is to restore hydroelectric power in Scotland. For this season, all of a sudden, everything is much grimmer looking, and the cast no longer looking like they've just stepped out of the makeup van. Leftover resources are becoming more and more scarce, and packs of wild rabid dogs are a massive problem. There are also far more predatory characters lurking, such as one episode where Brian Blessed is dressed as Fred Flintstone, but disappointingly never once screams yabba dabba doo. Charles at one point is on his own and hunted by locals who worry that he might be carrying rabies. Greg is accosted by some thugs and left for dead. He contracts a terminal disease similar to smallpox and pretends to cut ties with his friends in order to infect the thugs and their cronies.
Greg has smallpox.
And an attempt by Agnes to set up a government in Greg's name hits a few snags. Chiefly, Greg is dead. Jenny had been having conflicting feelings about searching for her husband over several episodes before the confirmation of her fears that Agnes had also loved Greg.
Long live the king.
Electricity is restored in the final episode, but in a show called Survivors, things had almost gotten back to square one, though it's a square one where finding a parking space in what remained of London was much easier than before.
Oh! Whoops.
Season 3 is almost a British version of Mad Max, but as it's Britain in the 1970s, it's less Mad Max and more like really cross Max, or possibly absolutely livid Max. It's much grimmer and yet more hopeful, and yet grimmer and yet more hopeful. We have communities, we have more villains, and it all starts to unravel towards the end, since it's really hard to do a show where the main characters constantly talk about people who aren't going to show up anytime soon thanks to an offset beef. Because Ian McCulloch had in effect left but not left, the other characters never get out of the rut of saying, well, what about Greg? Which really does hamper them moving the story forward in any significant way.
You just can't forgive him, can you?
Who?
Greg.
But this season does feature the escapades of Survivor's biggest stud, Hubert.
There's no point in suffering.
It also didn't help that the producers felt unable to build up side characters unless they were to be killed off. At least Game of Thrones had the dragons and the boobs. No sooner than a new character had been introduced, then they'd be killed off, or more often than not, they would just be forgotten about and never mentioned again. This has become known as the Chuck Cunningham syndrome, but that was just one character in Happy Days, compared to what seems like a dozen characters that were introduced and randomly disappeared, like rational thought in a sovereign citizen. Some of these characters would last longer than others, including the producer's reluctantly acting son playing John, where here he's a ghoulish kid auditioning for The Omen.
You'll be dead soon. Goodbye.
The entire series would be about a small group of people trying to build a community while at the same time defending themselves from people who just wanted to scavenge and take what they wanted. Since this was a show where the world has to be rebuilt, we would often get characters setting out their philosophy, a theory on what might happen, how things will transpire, but from a middle-class writer's perspective. Survivors does tend to lean on old stereotypes, where many of the leadership types are very well spoken, and anyone else further down the pecking order often sounds more common or regional, or a combination of the two, cogional.
Intellectual type! You're not a tax inspector, are you, Charlie?
One terrible effect of the world ending in 1975 is that the survivors who have to deal with famine, disease, marauders, and packs of rabid dogs are also, unfortunately, locked into clothing that was fashionable in 1975. So everyone in this dresses like my maths teachers did in the mid-80s.
Oh no.
Survivors is a bunch of good ideas that aren't always explored very thoroughly. Like that friend who's always coming up with schemes that sound amazing until you give them 30 seconds worth of thought and realise just how terrible the idea is, like starting a YouTube channel.
But what does it mean?
Survivors did get to a point where a new society basically started to mimic the old one by reintroducing currency and getting hydroelectric power working. Survivors as a series, especially in its final year, found it very hard to decide whether it was just about a small group of people, a small slice of society, or about grand ideas of re-establishing trade, electricity generation, and government. Maybe by the time the final series was shown in 1977, self-sufficiency may have just had its day. After the 1977 series, Survivors did not survive for a fourth season.
If Greg assures me that all this organisation you set up's really going to work, I'll be the first one to help him.
Survivors was a show that I had not much knowledge of before the 90s. I'd heard about it because it was a Terry Nation created series, and I'm a fan of Blake Seven, obviously, but it wasn't until, say, the mid-90s that I actually was able to watch it sporadically when VHS releases began and then stopped, and then later on I was able to watch the whole thing on cable television where I lived. I enjoyed Survivors for what it was. I felt the first season was by far the best. The second series was a little too cozy, apart from all the supporting characters suddenly dying, where they died more randomly than on a board game night where things go downhill rapidly after somebody produces some cocaine and a loaded revolver.
Any unscrupulous gangster can prey on anyone he likes, then he becomes king.
The third season had some very good episodes, but tells some confused stories that rumble along until somebody turns the lights back on. It's hard to be enthused by watching people struggling to survive when they can just pop on an electric kettle to brew a cuppa. I've always been entertained by the original despite its lack of frills and its decidedly downbeat demeanour. It may have gotten a bit confused by the end and in many ways is very much of its time, but it is still an interesting and unique series for the time. Survivors ended at a point where there was nowhere for it to go, leaving us with a relatively natural point to leave these characters. I mean, if there was a 4th season, who knows how many of the characters would be written off the show after excusing themselves to use the loo.
Just can't get the staff.
Terry Nation would later write a novel that would expand on the events shown in the 1st season as he had originally envisaged the series. That was before Terence Dudley's changes. In other words, people in Land Rovers with shotguns. Or was that people with shotguns in Land Rovers? I forget.
Well, there's millions of people who have died. Don't they mean anything to you?
People who saw the show remembered it, and remembered it well, despite Survivor's lack of contemporary repeats on the BBC. In the years since the show had ended, there had been several attempts to revive or relaunch the show in some way. Recently, there have been audio dramas based on the original series, but back in the 90s, Ian McCulloch had at one point gotten somewhere with perhaps making a new live-action series for BBC Scotland, but that didn't happen.
Will bitterness help?
By the time Survivors did reappear, it was based a little further south, but not as far south as before. This time, like Oasis, the end of the world would centre around Manchester. An updated take on Survivors launched in 2008.
Are all either dead or dying?
Shot on 35mm film, it was a much more cinematic looking show with a budget to match. Many of the same characters and character types are there, and several situations seen in the original series form the inspiration for events in the rebooted show. But there are also new characters and new situations, and this show will have a focus more on action-adventure than people sitting around the kitchen table having debates about making soap while skinning rabbits.
I want guarantees.
The creator of the 2008 series was writer Adrian Hodges, somebody who'd had a good pedigree as a television writer adapting classic novels and serials. He'd also be a co-creator of the series Primeval and would later create the BBC series The Musketeers. In any publicity for the 2008 series, the 70s series was rarely, if ever, referenced by the program makers.
Whatever you say.
Terry Nation's original contract stipulated that he retained merchandising and novelisation rights, and so the 2008 series was made by negotiating not with the BBC, but with Nation's estate. Hence the distinction, at least contractually, between a remake of an old BBC show and an adaptation of Terry Nation's novelisation. I get it, I have similar stipulations in my own contracts, whereby I'm not able to go horse riding, but I can ride a mule.
You can learn a lot from books.
The 2008 series is an action-adventure series with very little discussion of making soap, raising cattle, or turning excrement into methane gas.
Oh, come on.
Which probably made the series more palatable to general audiences, but would disappoint people who were way too invested in all of the things you could do if you had a load of animal poo.
Any sign of a farm?
A virus initially thought to be a bad strain of flu ends up wiping out almost the entire population of the world, and then some. Survivors somewhere in England band together on a stretch of deserted motorway. A Scottish mum living in England, Abby Grant, feels a bit off, has a fever, and wakes up a few days later to find her husband dead.
Oh, shit.
And the people next door are dead.
Oh, shit.
And the people across the street are dead.
Oh, shit.
And the people down the street are dead.
Oh, shit.
And that really snooty lady down at the post office.
I'll burn in hell, you evil cow.
Abby Grant wants to find her son Peter. Practical but reserved Greg Preston doesn't want to commit to being around other people. Anya is a doctor, but she wants to keep that quiet. Aleem, or Al, is a rich playboy who just wants his expensive stuff back without any hard work. Najeed is a boy looking for his family. Sarah is a spoiled brat who's not above using sex to get what she wants. And Tom Price is now from Manchester, and at no point does he try to sell you sheets.
It's not Lord of the Rings yet, is it?
Flies, you mean Lord of the Flies.
In this Survivors, nobody speaks in received pronunciation, and it was a cast with relatively high visibility on British television. Julie Graham, Max Beesley, Paterson Joseph, Philip Rhys, Zoe Tapper and more. Still, as a sign of the times, none of the survivors in this did their weekly shop at Waitrose.
This is ridiculous.
It's not a quiet survival drama where people will have long debates about which smells worse, turning poo into fuel or turning animal fat into soap.
Why not?
But it is a thrilling action-adventure series full of action, fights, explosions, violent disagreements, thugs trying to assert control. Here, when characters do not like each other, they really do not hold back. Here, the survivors don't get much past the stage of foraging from whatever was left over from before the virus. After the first episode, the show manages to stick to deserted roads and isolated homes in the country, much like its forebear, and avoided showing decaying cities overrun with rats for a bit. And then it was time to pop into the city again. At no point does 2008 Survivors turn into a slightly grimmer version of The Good Life.
I found this in my room doing something on my bed.
An egg?
There are a few philosophical discussions on the nature of survival and humanity, and characters do get to talk about where their heads are along the way. But much like my last chat with my former optometrist, the talking doesn't get in the way of explosions and fistfights.
What, is this a joke?
There are stories that harken back to the first series. Jimmy Garland appears, and the character of Sarah is a version of Anne Tranter, except here Sarah becomes a regular rather than Bob, the crippled man she abandoned. However, there are villains aplenty. Samantha is the last surviving member of the government who thinks she has the answers to restoring order, but only at the cost of her soul and her principles. Dexter is a thug who latches onto her government as a way to expand his own power. There's a sinister something where some sequestered scientists who have not been exposed to the virus are working on some form of cure, except the lead scientist, James Whittaker, is about as ruthless as a cat put in charge of a veterinary hospital.
To get the best results, we should reinfect her.
Abby now feels like an actual middle-class mum, or in demographers' terms, she's a DINTC, which stands for double income, no tennis court. Greg is still vaguely disinterested, but he's no longer an engineer, but instead he's a systems analyst.
But there's no food, there's no water, there's no alternative.
There are hints of the Ruth character in Anya, though there's no analogue for Charles Vaughan or any characters from past the first season of the original television series. There's a Jenny mentioned very early on as Anya's ex-lover, played by Freema Agyeman, who, despite being in some cast shots promoting the series, dies in episode 1.
Nothing's the same now. Old rules don't apply, do they?
The biggest change is in the character of Tom Price. He was no longer a combined source of both humour and revulsion. Tom Price starts off the series in prison with 20 years left to go on his sentence and only gets out after killing the last prison guard who was about to abandon Tom in a locked up storeroom. Tom tries to hide his past, but this is a drama. You know his history is going to come out over the course of the first season, and every now and then his temper will flare up, leading him to revert to type and killing again, though it's often in the service of protecting the group, or so he thinks. Throughout the course of the first batch of episodes, Abby's new group will split up and recombine more often than Voltron after a series of false alarms. Sometimes one or two will leave, but they'll always return to the group by the end of the episode.
You heard them noises in the night?
No, I didn't hear any noises.
No?
Many of the characters here will get some lovin' over the course of the series, though not all of the pairings will last. Sarah will at first rebuff Al's advances, try it on with Greg, and then Tom.
I've forgotten how much fun sex can be.
Al makes a pass at Anya, but gets nowhere. He'll hook up with a girl in a cult who's just looking to get pregnant.
What was that about?
Mike's my boyfriend.
And finally, he and Sarah will fall for each other. Abby has a tryst with Jimmy Garland. Tom has a major crush on Anya, while she's not sure if she can trust him. Plus, there's that pesky idea that the thing they have in common is that they both like girls. By the end of the series, Abby and Greg are also growing closer. The group will become a family of sorts. Al, the callow playboy, finds himself becoming Nadja's surrogate father, while Abby is still on the lookout for her son.
And do you know what mushrooms are okay to eat and which ones will kill you?
The first series would mainly be about smaller stories about the survivors, which would lead to a big cliffhanger ending. Series 2 in 2010 would pick up things with a larger scale. Abby's group are mainly mobile and spend most of their time fending off the various challenges that threaten to break up the group.
Whatever this task demands of us, we can't lose our humanity.
Season 2 resumed with Greg having been shot, and Abby's been captured by Whittaker's group because her blood may be the key to a cure. But she probably won't survive as a result of the research, which as a plot device seems as good as any to be pinched for The Last of Us.
Without you, they can never come back.
Sarah ends up being used by a thug as a payment for borrowing equipment to rescue Al and Anya from a collapsed building, while Samantha puts Tom on trial for murder.
Because he killed a man in cold blood.
This series, Greg attempts to banish Tom, but Tom will just let it all hang out. And then Tom and Greg are sold into slavery mining coal. Roger Lloyd Pack would appear as an untrustworthy trader, where he'd also played a different character in the original series. Oh, and Abby's son Peter is still living. Greg remembers an odd postcard he'd received before the outbreak. It contains some coordinates, and he tracks it down to an airstrip where some group had organised an airlift of select people, but instead he finds a dead end. For the audience though, is it related to James Whittaker's mysterious boss? A group who avoided exposure to the virus are at a secret location waiting for Whittaker's cure. Are Greg's kids and his estranged wife actually somewhere safe? When one of the group dies thanks to continual infection of the disease now transmitted by bird life, Abby decides to allow herself to be studied for a cure. Except she's arrived at the lab too late. A vaccine based on Abby's total immunity is developed, and there's the argy-bargy recovering Peter from the people who actually caused the virus. Survivor's second series ended on a cliffhanger with hopes for a third, but the virus seems defeated and Abby is reunited with her son. So while more episodes would have been great, this is a reasonable enough place to end the series. You know, it's not too hard to work out what Tom Price would get up to.
Greg, does this really matter now?
Don't know. It might.
Season 2 debuted in 2010 and went in for bigger set pieces showing cities decaying around the survivors. While the show was still set in the same basic area, much of the filming was now carried out around Birmingham. Conspiracies, constant chases, fight scenes. Yeah, I know my family barbecues can get a little wild, but if you have conspiracies, constant chases, fight scenes and deserted cityscapes, you pretty much have the second series of Survivors, which has all of this in a way that the 1970s series could not dream of competing with. However, an expensive series needs to rate really well, and Survivors was not renewed for a third series. After 12 episodes over 2 series, Survivors was again done and dusted. Apparently in 2010, a deadly killer virus was just deemed too far-fetched.
So they didn't hang around?
At the time, I watched it and I thought it was okay. I left it at that, but now watching it again many years later, I see what the show was going for in a time when Doctor Who's rebirth had kick-started more fantasy-based programs being made for British broadcasters.
You're actually excited by all this, aren't you?
The 2008 version of Survivors does what it set out to do, put a lot of action on the screen. It's often loud and noisy with a bombastic score straight out of an action movie. The characters are just interesting enough thanks to solid casting, the plots are fun enough, there's thrilling action, mostly decent dialogue. However, despite everyone playing this fairly seriously, occasionally there are hints of very strong cheese emerging whenever the script explores sentiment, and at the other extreme when the show doubles down on its grand conspiracy angle, where, in this particular case, it can feel a little trite with borderline mustache-twirling villainy.
If any of you come any closer, I'll have to kill you.
I ended up enjoying the series for what it was, popcorn entertainment.
I've nothing better to do.
If you came here expecting talk of methane production, it's best just to fart into a mug and take a long hard whiff.
All right, I'll do it for you.
Again, it goes without saying that a guaranteed way to make any remake, reboot or new adaptation worse than the original would be to try and make it as a carbon copy.
It'd be a bloody disaster.
The 2008 series can get a bit silly at times in trying to keep the adrenaline pumping and not giving the characters or audience much time to catch their breath, but I liked it.
Come on, Peter. I'll take you to your mother. Only take a couple of minutes.
Both of these series have a fair bit in common, where main characters try to survive, try to regain their independence or freedom, get away from philosophies they don't agree with, and more importantly, retain their humanity. These days, to do that, often we just have to delete Facebook, or, even better, just turn the phone off for a bit. But another point that both series make, maybe it's not a bad idea if we try to avoid the end of the world after all. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.